A brief background about myself for those of you who weren't here yesterday. I am a worker with the UCB Social. That's my employer, and I'm an academic coordinator there. But prior to that work that I'm doing now, I was an ethnic studies teacher in East Oakland, California, and have been in education teaching for 10 or 11 years before coming to this work. So not all of those years were spent working in ethnic studies. Some of those years were working as a world history teacher and a humanities ninth grade teacher, and also some 6th and 7th grade teaching in Florida, working social studies there, which is a much different proposition any of us deal with here in California. So I come to this space with a little bit of background in both teaching ethnic studies in a unique course and sort of integrating some of the ideas and disciplines in previous courses that I had taught. Now, before we get too far, I just want to set up how we'll do some work today. Participants, I do want to see if you can change your Zoom name again this time, but this time I'd like you to change it just a little bit differently. Last time I asked for you to change your screen name to the span of your grade, be it middle school or high school or elementary. This time I want to sort this a little bit differently when we go to our breakout rooms. So if you can put the specific grade that you want to teach, or the specific grade that you are focused on teaching with this particular lesson, teach a couple different grades. And when you're done with that process, Devin is going to release a poll. Just a couple of questions. And you teach, and if you attended that first session. So take the next minute or two to sort of change your name and answer those poll questions, and then we will begin.
You were cutting out a little bit. Do you mind repeating the direction?
Sure. The directions for today is that when you're in here and you want to, we want you to change your name to be able to divide us into breakout a bit easier later on. So the way that this on the screen right now, the shared screen, change name level or the grade level that you would or you intend to focus on anyway with today's session. So if you teach multiple grade levels, you know, let's say you're focused 7th grade as opposed to the 6th grade class, you also have a section. So whichever one is the one that you intend to focus on today, please change your screen name to like that number grade and then your name. So dash your name. And also Devin has released a poll. So if you can take a moment to sort of respond to that poll, it's just a couple of questions and the poll should be in progress now. So just go ahead and take a second to answer those 2 questions and then change your name and then we're going to begin. I'm sorry if I'm breaking up a little bit. It's hard for me to judge that that's happening on my end. Apologies. And one last time, just because I know it's going to make Devin's life a little bit harder if we can't adjust this. If you have entered the room and you see that your name is Jason Muniz, you can go ahead and change that. And immediately put your screen name as it appears on the screen displayed in front of you with your name, your grade that you specifically teach or focused on, your name. And especially if it says Jason Muniz, you're going to want to change your name from off of my name. And it looks like most, we have 81% of the folks who have entered have responded to the poll. So
I'm having trouble changing my name. It's not where it was yesterday.
So it could be that.
Okay, hold on a second. I see myself now that I unmuted and I'm talking.
Okay, can you
okay,
find?
Okay, I can do it. And so it was, I'm sorry, it was grade level?
Right, your grade level, dash, and your name. So that way, when we come to breakout rooms, just a little bit, it'll sort us a little bit more thoughtfully.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right. No problem. Thank you for letting me know. And at this point, I think, Devin, like most of us have voted on the poll. If you haven't done so, try and enter in your response to the 2 questions in the next 15, 20 seconds so we can close the poll and we can begin. All right, great. Our poll is closed. So let's begin. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in the poll. That's going to help us with some of the work that we're going to be doing going forward. And let's go ahead and get started. Once again, I appreciate your all being here and thank you for participating today. And today, again, we're talking about integrating ethnic studies into other K through 12 courses that could stand to have a little bit of ethnic studies processes and concepts integrated within it. So let's talk about how we'll do that. So first, before we get too far, growing up, many of us in this room right now have made the observation that what we were learning in school just didn't sit right. And for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, this feeling has been particularly acute. Activists like the Third World Liberation Front described education that they had been provided like so, what you're seeing on the screen. Take a moment and sit with that. Now, the activists in the Third World Liberation Front were clearly not alone in this thinking. Others, including other writers like James Baldwin, also expressed their dissatisfaction with what was being taught in our schools and the harm that it was actually causing. Reversing negligence and ignorance is what motivates many of us to do the work that we're doing and inspires us to attend workshops like the one that we're attending right now. As history teachers, we have a unique role in the process of reimagining and restructuring the narratives that are taught to our youth. And really one way to move that effort forward ends up being meaningful and ultimately transformative is to introduce concepts and practices from ethnic studies into our classrooms. Now, that's much easier said than done, and why we're here today. Before we get too far along, I would like for you all to share a little bit. What is a challenge that you expect or have already experienced when integrating ethnic studies concepts into your history instruction? In a moment, well, Devin should be right now placing into the chat a link for you all to respond to this prompt. It's going to be on the screen, and I'll be sharing our responses on the shared screen that we're all looking at just a moment. But please take a moment to sort of share your thoughts about the challenges that you're expecting or have already experienced when you're trying to integrate ethnic studies concepts into your history instruction. We'll have a look at that in just a moment. So seeing lack of support from families or administration, the sort of marginalizing of ethnic studies as a discipline, appropriate resources lacking. The framework for advanced placement is an absolute challenge. Absolutely agree. Pushback from conservative students or parents. Yeah, that's absolutely going to be a factor in some of the work that we're doing here. We'll talk about that somewhat and how to, or an approach to overcome that. That is absolutely not foolproof, but we'll talk about it. And to weave ideas rather than insert a chunk, right? That comes to the idea of really decolonizing an entire syllabus, and hopefully we'll touch on that a bit. Sure. The gaps in our own knowledge and our own education. Absolutely. So I don't want to dwell on our responses here too much or shout out every single one of them. Just know that these responses I will definitely make available for us to sort of review at the end of our session, because sometimes it's pretty valuable to look at what other teachers and other educators in the same space are sort of confronting when they're trying to do this integration and trying to think about how ethnic studies concepts really fit into what they're already teaching. So but it's definitely valuable to look at this, and we'll make this available at the end for everyone to review at their own speed. So let's go back. Okay. So what I'd like to do, well, first, before we get too far, one last time, and I'll stop harping on this in a second. If you can, please go ahead and change your names, because in a little while we will be moving into that collaboration space where our names will be what sorts us into different groups. So if you can, if your name is Jason Moniz for some reason right now when you enter the room, please go ahead and change that. But then go ahead and change it to the grade that you intend to teach, or the grade that you intend to focus on, then dash, and then your name, so we can sort you just a little bit easier later on. All right. Thanks again. Okay, so now let's talk about integrating ethnic studies just a little bit. And integrating ethnic studies into K-12 social science instruction is an undertaking that requires a great deal of thought and care, and some of you who have already taken on this work in the past know that to be true. Now, in order to live up to the ideas that were the foundations for ethnic studies, like were mentioned by the Third World Liberation Front and some of the other readings that we looked at a little bit yesterday, there'll be a need for some important changes, not just with our students and what we're instructing our students, but really with ourselves. And that's bigger work than we can really take on during this time and space. We can start to think about some of the ways we can change our instruction, but ultimately, in having done ethnic studies instruction for a few years, it really does call for some sea changes in yourself and the way that you approach teaching and the way that you approach a lot of other things in your life. And taking on this work wholeheartedly calls for some of that. All that is just by way of saying that we need to set some realistic goals for what we're going to be able to do today in a 90-minute session. And realistic goals for this session would be to name some of the guiding principles on how to shift our instruction, and some of that deeper work that is required to, like I said, decolonize our syllabus will take time. And towards the end of the day, I'll make some or describe some steps that we can take as far as next steps to continue doing that work. Okay. So a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, because my thinking around recommending the practices that I'm going to share with you has been informed by my experience with teaching ethnic studies in OUSD. So if you were with the session yesterday, you would have seen this exact same definition of ethnic studies. And one of the documents that I asked for some folks to pre-read today was the framework for ethnic studies in OUSD, and included this piece of language right there in that framework about how ethnic studies should really be defined. I encourage you all to, if you haven't already started working on that from yesterday, develop a definition that works for your specific school context if possible. And today I'll be sharing examples of practices, and please just take them as that, examples tied into the integrating ethnic studies into other courses that relate to this definition. So all my thoughts and moves around integration are really focused on the framing that I was provided when we started working on ethnic studies in the school district that I was a part of. Which is why I sort of encourage you to develop your own definition, because that will inform the way that you go about integrating ethnic studies in your particular space. That said, here's OUSD's definition. And what I took from this definition when I started doing this work were some important practices that need to be done in ethnic studies courses, as well as any K through 12 social science course. And so I'd like to name some of those practices today with you, so you can get an idea of what we'll be talking about during the rest of this session. So by our definition that we had for ethnic studies, it showed that, that ethnic studies is a content of pedagogy that humanizes and empowers all people by honoring histories and cultures of historically marginalized groups, by employing multiple disciplines and perspectives to critically analyze systems of oppression, and by promoting action and solidarity with others to transform student lives and community. So again, by that definition, ethnic studies integration calls for students, to my definition, or to my understanding, to engage with identity and worldview. We'll be talking about that and what that looks like in our classrooms. It calls for students to critique historical narratives. And again, I'll expand on what that means and what that might look like in our classes. It also calls for students to make personal and community connections to the historical topic that we're studying. And finally, ethnic studies concepts that are integrated and practices that are integrated into social science courses should call for students to be empowered to transformative action. And that part is ultimately going to show up as pretty important in the process. It's one of the things that makes interrogation of ethnic studies really an ethnic studies alignment, because it's the empowerment to transformative action and facilitating that transformative action that's what sort of separates it a bit. And as I said, we'll be going and looking at each of these four in a little bit of detail as we spend our time today. All right, so first thing is I'd like to discuss these practices and show you an example of them one at a time. Now, if we named our courses to reflect what they're actually centered on, courses like 10th grade modern world history might rightfully be called something like modern European history. US history might have a title like settler colonial expansion and America's rise to power, etc. Our courses wouldn't be what they're called. Instead, we call them US history, we call them world history, and what we're really teaching are histories that are centered on certain identities and certain worldview of dominant cultures. Now, this focus has worked to disengage our students because what's shared in our syllabi are narratives that rarely connect to their lives. Narratives about the identities of our students and their neighbors, with all the assets and dangers and misunderstandings and revelations that led to this moment that they're living in, has what's been left out. Instead, those dominant narratives prevail, while other narratives that might actually engage our students personally, those are marginalized or worse. Now, today what I'd like to do is I want to share an example of what it might look like to emphasize identity intersectionally in a way that allows for students to see themselves in historical narratives and make those connections that we want them to make, to sort of use history that they're being exposed to inform their thinking on the world that they're actually engaged with, as opposed to what they've looked at in the past. And I think making that connection to engaging with identity and worldview is a way that the students can make those connections and then sort of push a little bit forward to thinking about their instruction through a lens that makes sense with consideration of ethnic studies. So let me give you a little bit of example of what I mean. I chose an example today of a piece of history that might be focused, it seems like it's going to be focused on US history to 11th grade, and this is just an example. But I chose today the example of Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire to really emphasize the idea that talking about identity and worldview doesn't necessarily have to be relegated to studying geography or even the civil rights movements of the 1960s, which is where some of the ideas of identity and worldview start to really come up for a lot of courses. So today we're going to study this particular narrative as just an example, but any narrative that you may be teaching in your social science courses could really work with this example sort of swapped out. So this particular narrative, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, is about really one of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, a great big fire in, pardon me for a second. It's going crazy. A fire that went on in a factory in New York City in 1911, where the owners of the company locked the doors on the factory, and when the fire broke out, the workers couldn't escape. And so when we're looking at that particular historical narrative, we'll be looking at that narrative instead of just like a reporting of what happened in terms of the identities that are present in the actual historical actors. So let's say our class is studying the Industrial Revolution and focusing on the human consequences of industrialization during that period. We might ask our students to engage with a primary source document about that event. And one way we can engage the idea is to highlight the identity of historical actors in the first place. In this case, the historical actors in that narrative were the employees, the company owners, and the firefighters. Now, instead of just looking at the identity on the surface of those three that I named, we can choose to engage with identity in a more meaningful way. What if students were, instead of just naming out the workers, the employees, the company owners, and the firefighters, looked at each of those identities with a little bit more of an intersectional lens. And that's, again, something that we can do with each of those different identities. But what if we look at, just say, the employees in terms of who they were besides just being flat employees? In this particular narrative, the employees were women, they were poor and working class, newcomers and immigrants, foreign language speakers, European white, and they were young, ages 16 to 23. Now, acknowledging that identity is intersectional is important here because, like your students, the people who are the subjects of the narratives we teach are complicated, they're multidimensional. We also want to think and prompt our students perhaps to think about the worldview of the people in the narrative. And again, if we're looking at just the employees, and we can look at the others, the firefighters, the company owners as well, we can start to dig a little bit deeper about the worldview that each of the people with these different multi-dimensional narratives for their personal identity had. Those worldviews are a little more complicated than just saying employees think this. And so the more of the things that we name by diving deeper into the identities of the people in the narrative, it surfaces different cultures or different perspectives that the students may be able to identify with. So if you're a teacher in a community where there's a lot of newcomers, a lot of immigrants to the country, some of these things may resonate a little bit more and sort of draw the students into sort of drawing parallels to those in the narrative and themselves. And this is the value of showing a little bit of a deeper thinking around identity. The more parts of those different kinds of identity within each people are named, the better the chances are that students can draw connections. And the more connections that are drawn, this is where the work of humanizing marginalized people can really begin. One other thing to think about in this, when we look at this information, is what happens when we push the conversation after we've named all these different kinds of intersectional identities. What happens if we push the inquiry a little bit further and we ask whether or not the people of other kinds with other different identities have experienced similar narratives, and what those narratives might look like if they're similar or different to what happened in this particular story. So, for example, if African American or Chinese workers during the same industrial revolution were experiencing unsafe conditions in their workplace, how would those narratives be different if we changed any one of those intersectional identities to a different group? So that's a way to sort of extend the thinking of identity and worldview to some narratives that we typically would teach in our social science courses anyway. Now, before we gather today, I sent out an email just preparing folks to look at this section and think about this session that we were going to have. And one of the things that I asked folks to be able to do is come into the space with a lesson that they know they typically teach within the first third of the school year. I'd like for you to have that particular lesson or unit in mind, because I'd like to engage with a little bit of work that we can do independently for the time being, thinking about pushing forward a little bit more of naming intersectional different identities within the narratives that we're teaching. So in a moment, what Devin will do is paste into the actual chat window there a link that will allow you to make a copy of a document. Okay? Now, that document is going to be our resource set for today. And in that document, there's going to be a space that really looks exactly like the page that I just showed you with the examples of different identities of the employees for this particular example. And you kind of scroll down to see that example, but right underneath that example is a blank example of a graphic organizer that sort of looks like that. What I'm hoping that you'll do independently for the next 2 or 3 minutes is to take some time to reflect on a lesson that you teach in the span that you've sort of named on your screen name there, and write down some ideas in the spaces that are provided sort of parallel to what I provided in the example. So if you're teaching a unit or a lesson on ancient, let's say ancient Chinese history, what's a historical actor or a group of historical actors that are named in that particular unit? And how can you expand upon their identities to perhaps provide a space for a little bit more of intersectionality within identities to be named? And then think about what the worldview would be for those people with those different identities. Maybe just choose one identity and sort of name different parts of their identity and different worldviews that perhaps connect to those different parts of their identity. And let's spend the next 2-3 minutes doing that, and I appreciate it. And once we're done, I do have a question that I want to check in with you on that experience. So it's 10:27 according to my clock. Let's see, or 10:28. Let's stop at 10:30 and I'll check back in. We'll give you some time to sort of produce something on that document right Now, as many of you are wrapping up some basic ideas, of course, we know that this is nowhere near enough time to give this the full consideration that probably it deserves. But as you're finishing writing out a sentence or an idea about naming identity in a more broad way, think for a moment about the many identities of the historical narrative actors in the narrative that you teach, the one that you've named here. Look over that list there. Think about the many different identities that you've compiled, hopefully, these two or three. How might you challenge your students to make a connection between any of those identities that are listed in those historical actors' identities and their own identities? What could you say, or how might you challenge your students to see how those identities match some of the identities that they might share considering the specific school site and the specific context of your school? So that example that I gave was really high school oriented. So just to make sure that you know that you're not being left out, if you're an elementary school teacher, anywhere from K to 5, if you wouldn't mind taking a second, and this is for the use of all of us, because it's sometimes useful to see what other spans of grades really think on these things. If you're an elementary school teacher, if you wouldn't mind naming for us as a collaborative group in that chat, how might you, as an elementary school teacher, challenge your students to make a connection between any of those identities or an identity that's named in the historical narrative that you're teaching and the students that you're actually teaching? What is a way that you can sort of inspire them to make a connection? So if you wouldn't mind taking a second, just jot down a thought on that question. So that way we can sort of share a little bit while we're still in the middle of our session. And if our elementary teachers are a little shy today, then I encourage, let's say like middle school, since again, the example was lined up to sort of make it look specifically about high school. If you're a middle school or an elementary teacher, if you can think of a ways for students to make a connection between the narrative that you're naming, that you're sort of focusing on, and the historical actors within that narrative, what is a way that you can think of to inspire your students to see a connection between their own lives and the narratives that are going on inside that historical narrative that you're really sharing? So those historical actors, what are identities that they have, and what are ways you can link those identities to identities that happen with your students? So think about how their home lives link. And again, even looking at the example that I provided, if you're in a community where there's disparity with wealth, think about how those narratives could match the disparity of wealth and access to resources in just the example. So if the narrative that you'd be teaching has anything to do with disparity of wealth, perhaps, oh, well, there's students in my community that maybe have some challenges in terms of this and this, and perhaps that's a connection to sort of see if I can make with my students. So there's a lot of different ways to think about those connections, and there's your parents vote them into power, great. So the way that power is transferred, if you're teaching something in a historical narrative that talks about like how power is transferred from one generation to the next, there's a way to look at that. Loss of language. See, yeah, these are the ways that, like, if we highlight these parts of the historical actors' narratives, and that are really only exposed when we look at a lot of different things that compose a person and makes them sort of multifaceted and multidimensional. It gives our students a lot more chances to see, oh, I have this in common with them. And the connections that they're made will sort of draw the attention a little bit further and give them a little bit higher stakes when they're seeing what happens with the historical actors' narratives. All right, great. So with a different understanding of human identities now in mind, ethnic studies challenges students to be critical of narratives in which those people are actors. So it's not just now looking at a number of different identities, we're now going to make some critique those historical narratives to be able to think about what happened in history a little more thoughtfully. And how that happens is that with ethnic studies, the tools that ethnic studies students use to make those critiques a toolkit that we sort of supply our students when teaching an ethnic studies course as standalone is to give students some different lenses that we use to collaborate, and we develop on different lenses, sort of view different parts of history, different narratives. And one of the things that we want to cultivate when we're bringing together some integration of ethnic studies ideas and concepts and principles is the ability to have or to use these different lenses to look at historical narratives. So one of the things that we do, or some of the tools that we have, is we're going to spend some time identifying privilege and power relationships. That's a tool that we cultivate. And again, we want students to identify power, power over, power under, power with, also how power is created and how it's maintained. So identifying those privilege and power relationships, being able to do that is a tool that we can teach our students to cultivate, to sort of look through history or look at narratives and history through an ethnic studies lens. Also, we're going to ask our students to identify social injustices. Now, even as early as elementary, your students definitely have an idea about what is fair or what is not fair in their mind. Ask a kid, they know like, oh, that's unfair. They'll have opinions on what justice is on some level. So what we're going to try and to do with teaching in an ethnic studies lens is to really push our students to understand why something is just or unjust, what makes something fair or not fair, and to not just have them thinking about, equity or equality, but pushing forward to think about what is justice in these terms and these different narratives. Another lens that we provide for our students when we're thinking of ethnic studies and looking at our history through ethnic studies lenses are the critiquing historical narratives that allow us to recognize marginalization in them and dehumanization in those narratives. And now the more work that we do around identity, the more students will notice those marginalizations and dehumanizations. And those are the things that will ultimately lead our students to have a little bit more empathy for the historical actors that they're studying, but ultimately for each other. And beyond that, again, we're going to ask our students to identify those systems of oppression, the four eyes of oppression, the different systems of oppression. If you don't know those terms, part of being able to integrate ethnic studies into your historical narratives and the different content areas that you teach is getting perhaps a little bit more familiar with those different levels and systems of oppression that are out there for our students to engage with. And again, we want to challenge our students to see how those systems are created and to see how they're maintained. So again, drawing those current connections so they can see how those systems persist. And ultimately, we want them to see that these systems do persist, that it's not something that just happened in that period, it's now something that continues to be engaged with. Now, when ethnic students are sensitive to those particular historical narratives and they have the ability to critique those historical narratives that they're confronted with, they can begin to actually construct those counter narratives to the historical narratives we present thoughtfully. And that's the competency that we aspire our students to have, to not just look at a narrative, but to be able to construct a counter narrative based on some of the connections they can draw within themselves and the other people that they have empathy with within their communities. Now again, easier said than done, so I'm gonna try to give a little bit of a very basic example. And again, last time I'll mention, this is an example of work that you can do to develop these tools. I'm betting that your imaginations and talents will inspire you to accomplish this goal more elegantly than the organizer that I'm presenting to you all. But I just want to give you an idea, like this is the thinking, and these are some of the things we want to focus on. So these are some of the lenses that I like to use when I was teaching my 9th grade students, and some of the lenses that we typically looked at any historical narrative with are, we talked about privilege and who has power over. I'd ask my students to look at a narrative in terms of the oppressions or injustice that they notice, and to be able to name and think about what those are. And then I always wanted them to look at where there are parts where they notice solidarity or power with, exchange of power, share of, or just working together. And if we look at that, and in particular with the example of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, we can sort of get an idea of what I mean when I'm asking students to notice those. So if a student was filling out this graphic organizer, let's say, and thinking about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, they might name, all right, so privilege and power under, oppression and injustice, solidarity, power with, those would look like these. I also like for students to explain how the narrative might be the same when told by different identities, and what ways might the narrative be different? So again, if they don't have a specific connection to each one of these identities that are going to be named and all the different intersectional identities that are accounted for when we look deeper at the employees or the company owners or firefighters, how might the narratives be similar or different with different identities that perhaps we want to focus on? So if your theme for a particular unit is about race or about social class, now think about, well, what are the identities that aren't necessarily named that in this particular narrative, and what might they experience if this same narrative happened to them? So again, we want to think about all the different lenses that we can look at and how those lenses sort of skew or are different depending on a number of different identities. And once again, if you wouldn't mind to take the next few minutes to sort of reflect upon that lesson that you teach, that you were looking at in the first section. And these critical lenses, specifically the ones that I've named here, how might those lenses be applied to the historical actors in the narrative for that first unit or first third of the year lesson that you teach? And again, on your graphic organizer, on that document that you create a copy of, if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments to actually produce something right now. Think about how that lesson would apply to this sort of graphic organizer and what your students might fill in if they were thinking about, oh, in my lesson about ancient civilizations in Rome, how might privilege or power over or oppression or injustice or solidarity manifest themselves to those with different identities in that particular narrative that we're investigating. So again, take a moment, think about what you would put, think about what your students would put in responses to these prompts, and it'll give you a little bit of an idea about how we can develop some of these tools for the practice that we have in our own classrooms for different social sciences. So I'll give you a few moments to think and produce and write about that. Point out, and I like to mention, is whenever I ask students to think a little bit deeply about like similarities or differences, or really push them at all with some of their thinking, always ask for the justification. Always ask for the because. I find that whenever you can prompt students to explain their reasoning, even on a very basic graphic organizer, and especially when they're expressing their answers to any prompt verbally, I think this because, and you'll see I sort of modeled that in a lot of the different response areas that we'll see in our graphic organizers going forward. And yes, I know you can scroll down and check out what we're still going to be talking about in the future. Let's get there one little piece at a time. So as you've answered some of these or filled out some of the responses on behalf of what you imagine your students might put, what are some challenges that you can foresee in introducing these sort of different lenses to students who are taking your course? So like talking about privilege or power over as a lens that you want them to sort of notice in historical narratives. Talking about oppression or injustice as a lens that they're using to unpack historical narratives, or solidarity and power with. What are some challenges that you in your own practice foresee when introducing these different lenses to students who are taking your course? And what might students need to know to be able to use a tool of that lens going forward? What do students need to know to be able to think about those different lenses, or to consider those different lenses? And what are problems that you foresee in teaching that out? The first time that we collaborate or ask for some feedback, I asked for some feedback from my elementary and middle school teachers. So now I'd like to hear from whatever high school teachers that we have in the space. If you're a high school teacher, what are some challenges that you foresee in introducing those different lenses or any other sort of lenses along these lines to students who are taking your course? And what do students need to know? What do your students need to know to be able to use these lenses, to use those tools? If you would mind taking a second, sort of share your thoughts on that. Again, it's useful for people across different grade spans to get that feedback. Empathy and rather than hostility, and that sort of goes towards the more that you can build about those identities, there's more potential for folks to see common ground to have empathy about. Most folks, unfortunately, will only have empathy to somebody they can relate to initially, but the more they can see they can relate to a lot of different people, a lot of different circumstances, because identity isn't just one thing, that'll create an opportunity for that. Common vocabulary, for sure. Some of the work that might need to be done in integrating ethnic studies as a lens or as a view into your K through 12 social science courses is really thinking about what words do they need to know to be able to get some of those ideas to view it through an ethnic studies lens. So you might spend some time at different parts of the year talking about what is power, what is oppression, what is solidarity, what is privilege. So those are conversations that might have to take place. Use the term power over more than privilege. Again, depending on who you're trying to access, or for some people, the idea or even the word privilege is sort of triggering, like, oh, you're saying that I have this or X, Y. Like, I'm not privileged, I have, but maybe looking at it a different way in terms of power over, that might be useful to sort of frame it that way. Yeah, and the idea that privilege works outside of race. A lot of the narratives that are alive in our society right now kind of paint privilege only in terms of race, but obviously there's gender. There's a lot of other considerations that are connected to privilege, and we want to be able to have our students think about the narratives that they're going to engage with in those terms. All right, so yeah, a lot of great thoughts here. Yeah, universalize our ideas about race, class, and privilege. Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Mr. Chavez. So again, these are all just like insights into some of the lens that we use to develop ethnic studies thinkings in a lot of different potential courses. It's not the end all be all. It's certainly just a way to start thinking about how to do that, because we can see the value in what that work is. Another part of integrating ethnic studies into different courses that I think is important also is really making those connections between the narratives that the students are reading, the students that they're engaging with, reading or video or however you transmit ideas about what's happened in history, and making a connection between those narratives and their personal selves and their communities. And there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into that specifically, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit right now. So because once the students are using a critical eye to look at those historical narratives, ethnic studies really does challenge students to make connections between themselves and the narratives that they are engaged with. Now, in some narratives, the connections to one's identity can be painful or really uncomfortable, and we need to acknowledge that. I mean, what happens when in the narrative that they're studying, the people suffering injustice or experiencing brutality share the exact same identity as themselves? When students make that realization, that's a tough moment that's going to occur in your course. Or what happens when students become aware of the way that people with their own identity have been responsible for the marginalization or dehumanization of others? Again, that's a difficult moment to engage with in your course. And the more that we make connections about different kinds of identities and different ways that identities interact with each other, the possibility of those uncomfortable moments and those uncomfortable conversations present themselves. And that's sort of the cost of making personal and community connections to the historical narratives that we study, is that kids will actually make those connections, and sometimes those are painful moments. So when we engage with personal connections, it can create much higher stakes moments in your classroom. Difficult conversations can absolutely spin out of control on a bad day. But on a good or great day, these conversations can lead to honest to goodness growth and even some change. So students, when we have these conversations, there's conversations that'll be difficult, but it's also an opportunity to empower students to think about what it would be like to dismantle the way things have been and reconstruct narratives based on the practical knowledge and experiences that they have. So it has been this way, dynamic between these two different groups historically speaking, but you now, as someone who shares an identity with those historical actors, now have a little bit of agency to see how that relationship moves forward from this knowledge. And that's a conversation that actually talking about those connections lets happen. They have as students have actual agency about what happens next, what happens today, what happens tomorrow with those relationships. So when you make those connections, yeah, it can be tough, but they actually do have a little bit more agency about next steps and next moves. These are moments where, those exchanges where empowerment of the students starts to begin. They get to reshape what has happened, and we are able to really transform it into something better. If we look at a lot of different identities and a lot of different struggles that may be within those identities, we can also look at a lot of different ways that groups that may not have expected there to be spaces for collaboration and solidarity actually have had a history of those. And if we can talk to those as well, then it kind of gives an opportunity for those to continue out. So the more that we talk about, as opposed to farm workers, we talk about the the Filipino farm workers and the Mexican-American farm workers. Again, by extending a little bit more depth about what the identity is, now we can talk about how those sort of collaborations of solidarities can be expected going forward. That's just an example that can be extrapolated for a lot of different narratives that we study in history. Now, confronting the way that the past interacts with struggles of the present in a community and the context of students that they now share, that's what makes space for solidarity. And I want to talk about what that's going to look like in classrooms to sort of make those personal community connections. The only way to sort of make those connections is to really name them. Name the way that those different identities do intersect with each other and how they persist over the years, and what that really looks like to be able to talk about what could be done next. So again, I want to share a little bit of an example just from an example. And I do want you to think about the fact that this example I'm going to share, this practice works well when you're using visual prompts to sort of make personal and community connections. Visual prompts are excellent. They demonstrate the continuity and change between the two images and two periods of history, so long as you are a teacher are mindful to make sure that they're aware of the current context that allows for the personal connection to be made. However, for this demo, I'm not going to use images. Again, I've been using a graphic organizer with some a text around a reading. So let's continue with that just to follow through with the thinking. So this demo, I'm going to return to my graphic organizer that asks students to re-engage with the critical lenses in that narrative and then their own lives. And that's a place where there's still potential for agency when they look at their own lives going forward. So again, I might ask a student to look at that narrative that we had studied and those critical lenses and to describe the oppression or injustice they observed when they read that narrative. And then acknowledge, again, through those lenses, oppression and injustice, and then again, who held power and privilege and used in that narrative to marginalize others. And students could potentially name the factory workers. They were experiencing oppression and injustice because they were in unsafe conditions and they were not able to escape the factory that caught on fire because, again, justifying why that was an oppression or injustice. And again, who held power or privilege in that narrative? The owners, who had power over the conditions of the factory, chose to focus on producing more garments instead of making a safe workplace. And again, their thinking, their reasoning to the student's understanding. So again, looking at the historical narrative, but then pushing that forward and then extrapolate and then forcing the students to now look at it through a personal and a community connection. So then it asks something like, what is an example of a similar oppression or injustice that exists in your life or your community? And then how do those who hold power or privilege in your narrative that you just named use it to marginalize others? So again, now the students are being asked to engage with, all right, now I know what that oppression looks like in the narrative that was a historical narrative. Since I was able to draw a parallel between myself and this historical narrative, how does that oppression turn up in my own life or community? And if we're talking about unsafe working conditions, maybe students will bring up the McDonald's on Telegraph Avenue that is unsafe because the workers there caught COVID-19. Talk about current context. And then how does those who hold power or privilege in that narrative use it to marginalize others? Well, the owners had the ability to let people out of work. They held their workers to come in even though they were sick. And that's using power or privilege because. Again, these are just ways that students can take the narrative that they're studying and a specific part of the identity of the factory workers and their position and sort of make a connection to their own specific personal narratives. And that's important. Sorry. Because again, we can ask the students to sort of name out the similarities and differences and what those similarities and differences reveal about injustice in both of those time periods. Again, making those connections and show how the injustice here looks like injustice now, and injustice here doesn't quite look like injustice now because. So again, I want them to be able to engage with those thoughts and again, continue pushing forward of what the narrative that they're reading has to do with them. And even if it's a narrative, again, about something that's in ancient civilizations, we can ask our students to kind of push forward and make the connections to themselves by looking at the specific events through an ethnic studies lens, through a lens that allows them to sort of look at the way that groups have interacted with each other, the way that oppression and privilege exists. Those things persist over time. They persist now. So if we can look at what they look like then, We can now compare that to what they look like now. Now, as you're doing an assignment like this, one thing that you should note is a lot of folks kind of look at drawing connections between things that happened in the past and things that are going on in the future as an opportunity to give students assignments like ones that are role play assignments. I want to take this moment to make sure that you want to avoid role play assignments whenever possible. It's an example of curriculum violence, and curriculum violence at best is going to reduce the gravity of historical injustice whenever you do a role play. Asking your kids to act out slavery and modern day, like that's just it'll reduce what the exact historical event was like and what it meant. But further, it's going to inflict actual harm on your kids. So if those activities are part of your practice, those role play sort of assignments, ask politely to consider moving on at this time from those kinds of assignments. They kind of actually do a little bit more harm or a lot of harm than good in terms of what they're going to get at those instructionally. But again, I want to take a couple of minutes now to think about the sort of graphic organizer that I laid out. And again, the lesson that you've been cultivating, that you're thinking about using as an example. And, think about how might you challenge students to find a common ground with historical actors that they will study in terms of facing injustice or holding power and privilege, and then drawing connections that can be drawn between the many intersecting ideas that run through oneself as well as their community. I can imagine how the students might respond to a prompt that looks like that, considering the lesson that you're using as an example. Just as right now, like a thought exercise, and knowing that this work typically takes a lot more, and we would develop that a little bit more thoughtfully going forward, more than we're doing in this small space and time. All right, so please take the next just a couple minutes to think on that. And again, I'll ask for a prompt response in a little bit. All right, teachers, so thank you all for engaging with that. And again, I know it's not enough time, so I really have a fully fleshed out sort of thinking here. But as you reflect on this particular kind of approach, what might be difficult for students who have been challenged to make personal or community connections in this way? Like, what about this might be hard for your guys and your girls and all your students in your classroom? What about this might be difficult, and what kind of work might we need to be done in order to facilitate this sort of activity with your students? So again, thinking about the practical application, why would this be difficult for your students, and what kind of work might need to be done to be able to facilitate this and make this a little bit easier for students to engage with? So I'll throw this one out to all the teachers in the space if you feel like making a comment here. Again, it's pretty informative, I think, to see what other educators thinking when they're engaging with a question like that. So please feel free to just jump in and share your thinking regardless of whatever the grade span is. What might be difficult for students when they're challenged to make personal community connections? And what kind of work might be done to facilitate that sort of moment in your classroom? That looks like my response. Right, some students don't want to see themselves as marginalized, others don't want to see themselves as holding privilege. Yeah, and so that's why it's kind of something to consider, to show a lot of different kinds of intersecting identities. So that way, a lot of students who are resistant to the ideas of seeing themselves either marginalized or privileged can sort of look at different identities that perhaps they don't necessarily feel that they are specifically connected to, but once they're sort of broadened by the exposure to a lot of different intersectional ideas, they can start to draw those connections between themselves and others. And maybe that lift of associating oneself with different groups that may perhaps be privileged or marginalized would be easier once the amount of different identities they can connect to the concept of marginalization or privilege are broadened. It's a tough lift, and that's part of the work that's going into this, is really finding ways to make that connection. And we need to think about that more. balance between examining the counter narrative and avoiding presentism or judging the past from the present stance. Yeah, you're always going to want to make sure that the context, and the next slide, I think, or the next little graphic organizer, sort of talks to that a little bit. So that way the students can make distinctions between the circumstances that allowed for right now versus the same circumstances that allowed for whatever the narrative that happened then. We'll acknowledge that, but that's part of this. Why didn't they just escape slavery? I feel like that sort of thing, it's important for us to sort of broaden the narratives. And a lot of times our textbooks will focus on the fact that there was chattel slavery, but that not necessarily about how many and how frequent the attempts to revolt against that, enslaved riots and escape plans actually were carried out. So that also sort of speaks to what we choose to focus on in terms of the narratives. And one of the ways that we're asking students to construct counter narratives is, all right, so what's a counter narrative to this story, this narrative about the amount of slavery? If slavery were going on today, would no one resist it? Do you imagine that no one resisted it then? So those are the ways that we can sort of push that thinking about narratives a little bit more forward. And may reflect the parent biases and resistance to the fact that majority of the history books don't have. Yeah, and some part we want to think about like exposing students to the idea of questioning the writers of our history books and introduce them to the fact that there's more than one book in the library that they should have access to, and they should be empowered to consult. So again, great feedback from all of that, and I appreciate it. I'd love to sort of respond to and think about each one of these individually, and hopefully have a chance to at some time speak to some of them more thoroughly. Okay. So last one of the 4 parts that I want to talk about today was talking about letting our students be empowered to transformative action. Now, the study of injustice and systems of oppression can lead some students to feel frustrated or helpless. And I can absolutely speak to the fact that this is a critique that I faced as an ethnic studies teacher. It's my wish for your students that you do better for them. I felt like, or I got feedback from students and from families of students that my class would make students feel like it was the biggest Debbie Downer class, because we talked about a lot of things about systems of oppression and a lot of things that were troubling, and a lot of students just had a hard time with that. And your students will inevitably ask, when you show them or teach them these narratives that can sometimes be difficult, it's natural that they would ask, what now? What do we do with this heavy information? If teaching them difficult truths about the world they inherit is part of our work, it also follows that we teach them about how to deal with those truths. That's something that I wish that I had done better, and that I'm hoping for your practices that is done better, at teaching our students, as soon as they're engaging with something that's difficult, what the possible next steps or next move, or what people have done, or how to go about making things better, is something that we focus on when we're teaching something that is absolutely difficult in terms of the narratives that we're presenting. It's also important that teachers ask students to generate ideas about what to do next that are not ours, right? The ideas that are generated about what next, what happens next, should really ultimately be theirs and not ours. We can absolutely guide our students, but everything new that's created in terms of how to move civic action and social justice terms forward is really created by the hands of the youth. Our students will always be the ones who will innovate in terms of actions in social justice. And what we can do is facilitate those innovations by teaching them what's happened in the past and how that connects to them. But whatever happens next is really on them, and we can sort of put them in a place to examine what's been done and how to sort of remix that into something that works for their narrative and for their context. Your students are always going to be the ones who innovate in those terms. And I like to give an example of this. Many of you may have seen this if you're on the internet like that, but this is something that I stumbled across recently. It was a video that was released of a TikTok user's creation, where this user, and I'm not going to try to say the user's name, and sorry if you've seen this already, but this user used that medium to raise awareness about British colonization throughout history. And it's a little hard to read exactly what they wrote on their TikTok, so I kind of put the captions on the side, where one side of the screen is places where countries that Britain hasn't invaded versus countries that Britain has invaded, right? And let me just play it for you so you get an idea of what I'm talking about in terms of students pushing the innovation in social justice forward. And hopefully it'll play. Come back, come back. All right, so I'm not sure if everybody could see the video, or there's no audio on it, but there's music going on that's like basically naming dozens and dozens of countries, and every time she leaps over to one side, those are the ones that Britain hasn't invaded. When she remains there, the entire list of, let's say 20 to 50 different countries that she's named are all the ones where she remains still, while the countries of those are represented by Britain has invaded. I was hoping that the sound of that would be a little bit better. Sorry about that. But say what you want about this product. The example shows a student that has made a critique about a historical narrative. That student doesn't appear hopeless or helpless about the gruesome nature of the narrative. And if someone is watching their channel and had their awareness raised because they didn't know about any of this, then this relationship between the content creator and the viewer is an act of civic transformation. They've changed someone's mind just by using a medium that the students are engaged with. Like I said, they're going to be the ones who are going to be innovative in terms of what action looks like. What we can do is facilitate their thinking around those actions, right? This is an act of civic transformation, one that may have been informed by what was done and then transformed into something else that's possible. With that in mind, back to my much less creative model than what that student has created. Again, we won't dwell except to highlight the ideas from the different contexts of the world through historical narratives and the contemporary society have to be acknowledged. And again, what are some of the circumstances of the world and community that allow the injustice to happen? What are some of the ways that people might have collaborated to prevent this injustice? And how might people collaborate to fight injustice in each of those narratives? And again, looking at the different contexts, the possibility of different contexts historically, so that way the students will, on some level, acknowledge, hey, there are few laws to protect workers from being exploited, in this circumstance. And when they're looking at the more modern circumstance, they can see the circumstances are different for McDonald's employees and the narrative that they drew a connection to. And the same thing with the ways that the people have collaborated. Workers may have collaborated this way at the Triangle versus workers may have collaborated this way at McDonald's. And again, how do people work to collaborate to fight injustice in each of those narratives? So what are ways they might have collaborated? Which are ways that they did collaborate? And again, having students name those. And again, thinking about what is something that you personally, again, bringing it very personal to the student, could do to help the people in your narrative fight against the oppression or injustice that they are experiencing. To my mind, the most important part is at the bottom. That's where the student is challenged to imagine their own personal action. These ideas are the ones that do well to share because those are the ones that hold the possibility of inspiration. So if you're having students like sort of share out, the most valuable thing is, what would you do to support the person? And like have the students have an exchange of ideas, or I think I would do this. No, that wouldn't work because what about this? Well, what about if you tried this? Those are conversations that students can have only when they've made a connection between the narrative they studied and their own lives in a similar narrative. So with the time that we have going forward, I want us to sort of think about some of the things that I've shared with you all today. And it's time for us to kind of go into those breakout rooms. Now, in those breakout rooms, there's going to be 4-person breakout rooms, and starting in alphabetical order by their names, so that way we won't have an argument over who goes first. But what I'm hoping that you discuss in those breakout rooms is this topic, and each sort of take turns in engaging with it. But how do the ethnic studies practices described today make you think differently about your approach to history instruction that occurs in your specific classroom? So those different lenses, those different ideas that we talked about today, those different practices, how do they make you think differently about what it is that you're actually doing now or what you hope to do in this upcoming school year? And what I'm hoping is that when we come back from our breakouts, we can select someone in each of those groups just to report back in the chat to what it is that we spoke about and what were some of the ideas and some of the thinkings that came about. So in a moment, Devin is going to go ahead and send you out to the breakout rooms. Before we do that, and Devin does that, is there anyone who has just any questions about what we'll be doing in those breakout rooms going forward? And yeah, I will make sure I send out that TikTok as an example of the link to that. It's going to be in the resources that we have. And if it isn't there, I'll make sure it comes on there. All right. That said, I think there's no questions. So if you're with us, then please, Devin, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and sending our participants to the breakout rooms. And we'll be back in about 7 or 8 minutes just to talk about some of the report back of what we learned. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Apologies to the members of my breakout group. We we got cut off there at the end. We were having a good conversation, so not to support that. I'm sure many of you had an experience where we're mentioning some things, so sorry about that to my partners there. What I'd like to do right now is hopefully within each group, and unfortunately we didn't do that in my group, hopefully in each group some folks were able to kind of think of a person to represent their group, and then also what's something they can report back to the larger collective of us in the space right now in terms of reporting back of with some ideas about how ethnic studies practices like the ones described today make us think differently about our approach to history instruction. So if you wouldn't mind, if you were the elected person, or if you want to step up and just jump in there and just name that out in the chat. So again, everyone who is sort of in the space can sort of reflect upon what was discussed in their own groups versus in other groups, and we won't leave too many stones unturned. So if you can take the next minute or so to do that, we'll be wrapping up soon. Again, just share out as best you can in your group conversations. What were some things that came up in terms of how you might think differently about your approach to social studies or history, social science instruction? Yeah. History absolutely internalized different. If you didn't select a person, just jump right in and do it on behalf of your group. I'm sure no one will mind terribly. They're working towards developing empathy, recognizing multiple identities. If that's not happening in your instruction, it's worth really considering getting there. Examining events critically. You have to cultivate the lenses to examine them critically, but that's part of the work, and you can sort of do that with a little bit of some repetition, like for unit after unit, narrative after narrative. Well, we looked at last unit talking about power and privilege. How does power and privilege look when we're talking about this? Might be a way to sort of think about moving forward and really building that muscle. And you said something there, wondering about the challenges of distance learning, something that we're all thinking about right now. Getting deep with kids in Zoom on challenges with student engagement, especially about difficult topics. I don't have a lot of words on that right now, other than to say that it's better with smaller groups as opposed to like a big community like the one that we all just looked at on the screen with 50 some odd people or 30 people. If you have a class that's like at that level, it's going to be difficult. And please feel free to go ahead and speak to that and continue putting those into the group chat. I encourage you to keep talking on that. I do want to be mindful of our time, so let me share with you one last thing as you're sharing out in the Zoom group chat. I'm absolutely excited to learn about some of the things that you're sharing and how it would apply to different grades. I had a really productive conversation, I felt like, at the elementary ed teachers, and hopefully we can move those conversations going forward, because today was just an example of what I thought, but there's a larger spectrum to consider. Again, this is one person's thinking who's had some experience teaching ethnic studies and sort of doing some work of integrating. But the larger work really is around decolonizing our entire units and our courses. That's the next layer when it comes to integrating ethnic studies into the language in our practice. And that's a much deeper conversation than we would have had time for today. But if you are willing to share your brainstorms with me or a network of teachers, one of the things that I'm vowing to do is to help cultivate that sort of network. So please share your interest on the form that Devin is going to be placing into chat. It's a form where I'm going to collect some basic information about what grade level you teach, whether or not you'd be interested in communicating or being grouped with a specific affinity group, being grade level or anything else, or by a certain ethnicity, gender, whatever way you want to sort of group yourself. And one thing that I would like to do is sort of make those connections, so that way when you're thinking about how to shift your practices or shift your entire syllabus, it's not something that's done in isolation. We want you to be able to have a network of people to be able to do that. So that Google form is being sent out, so you can sort of do some of that work, and I'll follow up with you via email as long as you include your email, and we'll do our best to sort of put together those groups going forward, so you don't have to be alone in this work. Similarly, I discussed this in our first meeting. There is a Facebook group. Many people joined yesterday, but there's still a lot of opportunities to get in there and start those conversations. So whenever you're coming across a roadblock, whenever you can't see how to make this concept fit into your elementary ed or middle school or high school class, or how to draw your students out to make a contemporary connection, again, this sort of thinking doesn't have to go on in isolation. That Facebook group has teachers across a wide breadth of experience. Folks like myself who have been teaching it for a few years, folks that have been teaching it for 10 plus years, folks that are brand new to teaching ethnic studies are all a part of that group. And I would love for you to sort of use them as a sounding board, or at least another person to talk to. And I'll do my best to sort of connect you intentionally with some folks who have some affinities and other areas that need some support. So again, a lot of that work is around down the road, decolonizing our syllabus, how to change the entire trajectory of our courses. And hopefully that's the next layer that we'll get to once we get through with sort of thinking about the first moves, which are described here. Some great questions. If you want to continue with our conversations, I'm more than willing to stick around for a few more minutes and do that. But right now I'm going to go ahead and stop our video, but it was great speaking to you all, and I appreciate our time and collaboration. Feel free to use that resource page and share it with whomever. I'll also be sending out an email with the video of our session today, a link to that resource page, and hopefully a link to that TikTok video, because I understand that you're able to see it, but you weren't able to hear it. Apologies. So I'll definitely make it so that you can check that out on different terms. All right. Thank you, everyone. And if you're just joining us tomorrow, I'll see you tomorrow.